we have something to celebrate. 10 years of LR Timelapse, an idea that truly changed my life. Today I want to take you with me to the early days of LR Timelapse, to the time where I started myself shooting time-lapse, just a little sit-in around the campfire listening to old stories. It all started in 2010. I was working as an IT project manager and had the task to implement a new ERP system into a large corporation. That was truly a stressful job, which definitely required some balance, which I found in photography. The great advantage of this job was that the project sites were close to the Baltic Sea. Since I never really liked hotel rooms, I mostly lived in my camper van and spent the evenings at the coast. So after work, often I went kitesurfing and took care of my photography and filming. In 2010, digital SLR cameras already had picked up. That was also when Nikon released the D7000, the first Nikon which was also able to record full HD video clips. For me, that was a game changer that brought video recording even more in my focus. Because as a photographer, I really never liked that look that the formerly widespread camcorders had produced. This was also the time for experimenting with other cameras. GoPro had just released the HD Hero, a small action camera which could record in full HD. No question, I had to buy one instantly. The GoPro was a lot of fun. Of course, I tried everything. I mounted it on my car, but also on skateboards, waveboards, and wherever. Photo drones were still far from being in sight, so I mounted the GoPro up in my flying kite to get some aerial shots. And of course, I mounted it in my kitesurfing kite also to film myself while riding. I guess I recorded my first time-lapse on a trip to Costa Rica in 2009. I just mounted my old camcorder on a tripod and filmed the Arenal volcano for half an hour. After that, I just accelerated the footage. The idea instantly fascinated me, but the results were rather disappointing. I really hated that camcorder. But the GoPro then brought an interval mode for single photos, and this instantly sparked the idea of using photos to create time-lapse videos in me. I started experimenting with the GoPro, but quickly also switched to my DSLR, which I used to record image sequences for time-lapses. After I had shot the first image sequences, I need to somehow transform them into video clips. There were a couple of programs available to assemble JPEG sequences, but there was nothing for RAW files. It was in summer 2010 when I published a tutorial on my German blog on how to use the slideshow module in Lightroom 3 to assemble image sequences into time-lapse clips. For this purpose, I had hacked together a special Lightroom template which reduced the display time of each individual image to 1/30th of a second only, allowing a smooth playback of the video. Now every photographer, most of them use Lightroom anyway, could simply create time-lapse videos from single photos. And this worked for RAW files from DSLR cameras as well as for JPEGs, for example, from GoPro cameras. Time-lapse photography had instantly fascinated me. I could now create video clips in a quality way superior from everything that video cameras could do back then. But the potential visual aesthetics were only one aspect. Time-lapse photography could make things visible that the bare eye could not perceive otherwise. Of course, I also started with the classic moving clouds, but then I also experimented with all kinds of other subjects. Burning candles, moving shadows, and even sunsets. The sunsets quickly brought me to the point where the static editing in Lightroom was not sufficient anymore.
Beim Experimentieren habe ich schnell festgestellt, bestimmte Dinge gehen halt noch nicht. Zum Beispiel kann man keine fließenden Übergänge machen zwischen verschiedenen Parametern in Lightroom.
I needed to do different editings on different parts of a sequence. Common practice back then was to edit every single image a little bit different. As you can imagine, that was a tedious job that could take days. Personally, I've always rather preferred to program a smart solution once instead of having to do mindless tasks over and over again. That's why I started to code a small program that could calculate those transitions.
Im linken Bereich habt ihr ganz normal einen Auswahldialog für eure Ordner und ich suche mir jetzt mal den Ordner raus, in dem mein Zeitraffer von eben sich befindet. Und jetzt seht ihr hier, werden alle Bilder angezeigt, die in diesem Ordner sind, und hier rechts seht ihr die Einstellungen, die LR Timelapse da aus den Metadaten sich raussucht.
This program allowed me to edit the first and the last image of a sequence individually in Lightroom, and it then calculated all edits for the in-between images.
Und man hat dann die Möglichkeit, hiermit einen linearen Übergang zwischen diesen Einstellungen zu schaffen.
It then stored those edits into Lightroom's XMP files, which Lightroom then used to apply the edits. In order to relieve my colleagues from their tedious manual work, by the end of 2010 I released the first beta of my new program. I called it LR Timelapse. And the LR didn't stand for Lightroom, it stood for Level and Ramp Timelapse. After all, I didn't want any stress with Adobe. Quickly that solution went viral in the still small time-lapse community. Therefore now I started to spend plenty of my free time with programming. Mostly in my van, only in winter when it was very cold I swapped it for an hotel room. Also for shooting time-lapse this time was great. The many evenings close to the coast provided me with beautiful subjects. I was totally infected with the time-lapse virus. I wanted more. Therefore, I took a week off just to shoot more time-lapses at the Baltic Sea. Every night I sat at the computer and implemented new features. Version 0.9 then brought the possibility to do so-called can burns animations, where you could use different crops of your images to calculate virtual camera movements. You could zoom in and out, and you could also do rotations. Although I could now already edit some simple transitions, I was still far away from complete day-to-night time-lapses. Such complete transitions were called the holy grail of time-lapses back then, because everyone believed they were impossible to achieve without cheating. And indeed, even big players like BBC, they cheated by just recording a time-lapse during the day and one during the night and then cross-fading both clips. But I didn't want to accept a doesn't work. I was challenged. My idea was I would just change the camera settings while recording and then use LR Timelapse to calculate the transitions and level everything out. Another challenge that constantly bothered time-lapse photographers is the infamous flicker effect. caused by mechanical tolerances in the cameras that lead to slightly different exposures in between shots. Most common cause is the aperture not closing down to exactly the same diameter for each shot due to mechanical friction. For single shots, of course, this doesn't matter at all, but for time lapses even more. Until then, we had avoided this mostly by shooting wide open in order to prevent that flicker, but of course, this has other disadvantages. LR Timelapse 1.0 could now analyze the luminance progression of the sequence and automatically calculate deflicker corrections in order to produce smooth results. Also in that version I switched to a modern, dark user interface.
Ja, hallo, herzlich willkommen zur Vorstellung des neuen LR Timelapse. Mein Name ist Gunther Wegner und ich möchte euch heute mal die neuen Funktionen zeigen.
And I kept going. There was still so much to improve. For example, yet I could only calculate linear transitions or simple curves. With LR Timelapse 1.4, I introduced the auto transition. It allowed to define keyframes as star ratings in Lightroom, which you could edit, and LR Timelapse would then connect them with smooth transitions. So much easier. After all this coding at the computer, it was time for another time-lapse excursion. This time to Tenerife, a beautiful island, a paradise for photographers, and a great night sky. I was really looking forward to finally shoot stars without having to deal with strong light pollution. And again, I started my mornings with kitesurfing, and then I drove up to the mountains, scouting for beautiful locations where I could then do my Holy Grail recordings.
Das erste, was wir tun müssen, ist natürlich, uns ein schönes Motiv auszusuchen.
On Tenerife, I worked with a motion-controlled camera for the first time. The slider was built by a friend of mine, and I controlled it with the MX2 controller from Dynamic Perception. A definite challenge in programming compared to today's solutions. After dusk then, the night came with millions of stars, and I recorded my first real astro time lapses. It was a fantastic experience, especially the peace and solitude alone under the stars. Only interrupted by the frequent clicking of the camera shutters. After this journey, I made the film Canary Skies. In 2012, Diana and I traveled to Botswana, where we rented a 4x4 and spent 3 weeks exploring the country on our own. In addition to some wildlife photography, of course, we also shot a lot of time-lapse. Again, it was the nights full of stars that really got me hooked. Tenerife has only been the beginning. I was more and more fascinated from astrophotography and astro time lapses. Every night the Milky Way with a beautiful galactic center rose up in front of our eyes and cameras. Especially the almost complete absence of light pollution far from human civilization was a unique experience. I also had brought the slider that I already used in Tenerife to this trip. Additionally, I tried to add 2 more axes by using a modified astro mount called Merlin, which was quite popular at that time. The Merlin could also be controlled by the MX2 controller, but it was a real nightmare to set up. Literally none of the movements came out as planned. Nevertheless, we were totally fascinated by the results. Of course, I used LR Timelapse out in the field as well, and it was a practical use that gave me the best ideas for further developments. After the trip, I made the film African Skies, with our most beautiful time-lapse and wildlife photography. Meanwhile, my ERP implementation project had finished and professionally I faced new tasks. But my mind circled around LR Timelapse. More and more users were using it, and apart from the development, I had more and more support to give. Since 2011, I already had a website and forum for LR Timelapse where users could chat and also place their own ideas for further developments. My new job made me miss the evenings in my van. Also, I had to spend much more time commuting. In parallel, Diana was also reorienting. That's why I sat down one evening and wrote a business plan. In the first instance, to convince myself of a crazy idea. After that, to also bring Diana on board. And so we made the joint decision we would put all one's eggs into one basket. Not only me, but both of us would get self-employed with LR Timelapse. Talking about that today, it sounds so logical and without any doubts. But at that time, it was quite a leap in the dark for us. The advantage was we already had the whole thing up and running for 2 years now in parallel to our regular jobs. The solution was established. Nevertheless, we had to do the step from a free software to a licensing model. And of course, we could not know how this would be perceived. In any case, I wanted to maintain a free version. After all, my basic intention had always been to share my ideas, my developments with the time-lapse community and not to earn money in the first place. Mid-2012 I then released LR Timelapse 2 with a new workflow-centric user interface, the new keyframes wizard and many other improvements. There was still a free version, which now had a couple of limitations and additionally 2 licenses, one for private and one for commercial users. Fortunately, our self-employment started well, not only for LR Timelapse but also for some other activities that I now had the freedom to do. Due to my newfound flexibility, I could now also do other jobs all around photography, of course. By the end of 2012, I guided my first photo expedition to South America. Additionally, I started giving workshops and coachings all around my favorite topics: photography, time-lapse and filming.
Hallo, ich bin der Gunter Wegner aus Hamburg und begleite diese Fotoexpedition nach Chile und Bolivien als Fotocoach für die Teilnehmer. Ja, ich selbst beschäftige mich seit vielen Jahren mit der Landschafts- und Tierfotografie und seit 2 bis 3 Jahren jetzt auch mit der Zeitrafferfotografie.
In 2013 then, we got booked by NHK, a well-known Japanese TV station. They had seen our African Skies film and were really impressed by the night scenes from Botswana. They wanted more, they wanted us to shoot night skies, time lapses in 4K. Back then still something very special. And so we organized a 6-week self-drive safari through Namibia, Botswana and South Africa, always looking for the most beautiful landscapes and skies. With up to 3 cameras and better motion control equipment, we were quite busy, especially during the transition times and the night. This time we used the Stage 1 slider, and the Emotimo TB3 served as motorhead and control unit. Compared to the old one that I had used the year before, that system was so much easier and more comfortable to program. During the day, we needed to charge all of our batteries. That was quite a challenge, because often our only source of electricity was the battery of our Toyota 4x4. Importing the thousands of images to our external hard drives, which we used back then, was also a challenge. Sometimes we had to spend hours waiting for all images to copy while the laptop was connected to the Toyota's battery. Fast SSDs were not really widespread at that time. Of course, running low on the vehicle's battery would have been fatal out there in the bush. While we could charge while driving, we could not operate the laptop because of the dust. Therefore, during the night, I sat in our rooftop tent and started developing a special import module for LR Timelapse, which would facilitate handling of thousands of images. The importer could now copy the images from the memory card, rename them, create the right folders, and do all the required initializations in order to speed up the whole process. I can tell you that shooting time-lapse out in the African bush is not without challenges. One night, a hyena totally dismantled our slider.
Das ist wahrscheinlich das Risiko, was man eingeht, wenn man in Afrika Zeitraffer nachts aufnimmt.
The hyena destroyed all the cables and took away the slider's drive belt. Fortunately, at least the camera survived that attack. So I ended up mending the cables provisionally with help of my 12-volt soldering iron that fortunately I had brought with me. Then I exchanged the driving belt with our clothes line. Next time we would definitely bring more spare parts. My experiences in Africa went into a lot of new features in LR Timelapse 3, which I released shortly after our trip. Apart from the new importer, there was also a special Lightroom plugin for export and a dedicated video rendering engine right in LR Timelapse. This finally enabled me to get rid of those old hacked Lightroom slideshow templates and enabled a much better render quality. Also, I had built a feature to automatically level all those jumps that occurred when shooting those day to night transitions. I called it the Holy Grail Wizard. And now you didn't need to do all of those adjustments in Lightroom manually anymore. The wizard would calculate everything with one click. It turned out that it was a very good idea to proactively replace the old hacked templates in Lightroom with a proper solution in LR Timelapse. Adobe released Lightroom 5 and out of the sudden the old templates stopped working. That's why I needed to hurry up to release LR Timelapse 3 in order to get people going again. One challenge that we often faced in Africa was the need to frequently change the camera settings when shooting that Holy Grail sequences. First of all, it gets dark really quickly so close to the equator. That means if you get a little bit distracted and you forget to adjust the camera, you risk to underexpose your images. The second challenge is touching the camera to do that manual adjustments. Especially when you use motion control equipment, the camera builds up quite high and gets a little bit fragile. So if you don't take care, you end up with shaky footage at the end. My desire was to find a way to remote control the camera without having to touch it while it was shooting. I got in contact with Zoltan Ubai, the developer of DSLR Dashboard, a mobile app for remote controlling cameras. He instantly agreed to add a sophisticated LR Timelapse page to his app, which would allow me to realize everything that I needed for time-lapse recordings. Now I could adjust exposure, ISO and even the aperture without touching the camera. And also I got a nice preview including a histogram right on my smartphone or tablet. In Germany we say every wish has children, and that's exactly what happened. I wanted to fully automate that Holy Grail shooting. I would only need to invent an algorithm which would analyze the histogram and decide when to change the camera settings. That idea turned out to sound much easier than its implementation was. It literally took dozens of iterations between Zoltan and me before we had the solution for the Auto Holy Grail feature that we have today and which allows perfect day-to-night transitions without having to manually adjust the camera. Now, life as a time-lapse photographer has gotten so much easier. Set up the camera, program the interval, start the app, activate Auto Holy Grail, and then sit down to relax, have a beer.
Ja, erstmal Prost, ne?
Without constantly having to remind yourself to check the camera. Cool. LR Timelapse now also was quite mature and the Holy Grail technique worked perfectly. But there was still one thing that bothered me all the time. LR Timelapse could only display the flat camera previews and curves, but not the actual visual developments of the images. One day the revolutionary idea came to me under the shower. The visual previews were certainly the biggest innovation in LR Timelapse 4 and opened up completely new options. LR Timelapse could now calculate the deflicker based on the developed images instead of the camera previews. Depending on the degree of processing, this could be a significant difference. Deflicker improved immensely. More and more companies started to offer time-lapse services, which also included long-term time-lapses, for example, of construction sites. LR Timelapse previously only had offered a simple filter for this kind of work. In LR Timelapse 4, I added a special workflow for long-term time-lapses. It provided sophisticated filters for luminance, hue, and contrast. These filters allow to eliminate unwanted images from long sequences, leaving only a subset that looks as smooth as possible. Also, LR Timelapse 4 brought LRT Motion Blur, a smoothing and blending filter right in the LR Timelapse render dialog. Before, I always had to do a detour via After Effects only to accomplish this effect. Quite time consuming. By the end of 2015, I traveled in winter to northern Norway and challenged myself to capture the northern lights in time-lapse. Up there, northern lights are often so fast that you need to work with very short intervals. This brought my intervalometer to its limits. And so I started developing my own intervalometer and published it as do-it-yourself solution for everyone on the LR Timelapse website. It worked quite well, but many didn't want to tinker, and so they asked for a commercial solution. The LRT Pro Timer 2 then was born in 2018, and the first units went to the participants of my Astro and Timelapse workshop on La Palma. 2018, I also released LR Timelapse 5, a major upgrade. It provided a simplified workflow management, improved batch capabilities, and better motion blur. Also new was the option to apply the visual deflicker automatically in multiple passes until the result was really smooth. Of course, everything like always in a lossless way. Another new feature was the so-called compositions. They allow to project a whole time lapse into one image just by cutting it in slices. Also, there was some progression with the LRT Pro Timer. There was quite a demand from advanced time-lapse photographers, and soldering individually didn't work anymore. So I started looking out for a producer who would do everything made in Germany. At the beginning of 2019, I launched the LRT Pro Timer 2.5, smaller, lighter, and more professional. In summer 2020, I brought LR Timelapse 5.5, a major free update. The new version brought a complete new color management for monitoring and rendering. Additionally, there were a lot of improvements and performance gains. It's now been 10 years since I released the first version of LR Timelapse. Since 8 years now, I'm developing and supporting LR Timelapse full-time together with my lovely wife Diana, who is my biggest support. Sometimes it's not easy to be the only developer of a complex software like LR Timelapse. I remember, for example, one episode where I was once leading a photo expedition in the Altiplano in Bolivia. No internet, far and wide. I had set up my camera during the night to record a time-lapse and just wanted to quickly import it into LR Timelapse in the morning. But what was that? The program didn't launch at all. Fortunately, I had my develop environment on my laptop, so I tried to figure out what was going on. And suddenly it came clear to me it was a date issue. This was affecting every LR Timelapse user worldwide. Because for every single user it was the 6th of December. I will never forget that date. Perhaps you can imagine what these thoughts triggered in me. Currently, no one could work with my software while I was far away from any internet connection. Short time later, I received an SMS from Diana, the only thing that worked here. The first support requests were coming in, and I can only imagine how stressed she must have been at this moment. Fortunately, our primary support channel is the LR Timelapse forum, and the first users started sharing workarounds there pretty soon. In the meantime, I had already implemented a fix. Now I only had to find a way to upload it somehow. Fortunately, our tour led us across the border to Chile that day, where we stayed in a hotel which had internet. Took 4 hours to upload, but it worked. Those are definitely experiences that I can do without. Looking back, it was a crazy journey the last 10 years. I would never have imagined that I would once be internationally successful with a self-developed software that had started as such a simple idea. Especially the contacts, travels and experience that this created have completely changed my life. Do I work less now than as project manager? Certainly not. Does it make me happier? Definitely yes. You might wonder why we still run this company with only 2 people. We would certainly have been able to hire employees, rent office spaces, etc. But then I would be working in a much less creative way. I would have to deal with team meetings, personal management and administration. I had all of this in my previous jobs as a division manager and team manager. I don't need it anymore. I want to have the flexibility to travel, be independent of my location and without obligations to employees. Whether in my van or a mountain hut in Bolivia. But that would better have internet then.
So, auf geht's!
I hope that you will remain loyal to me in the future and accompany me on my way. I'm really looking forward to the next 10 years and I'm excited to see what's coming. And one thing is for sure, you are a very important part of it, if you like. That would make me very happy. Thank you so much.